In today's video, I'm going to teach you how to tape up a butt joint. Now, what is a butt joint and how does it differ from a tapered edge joint? Well, if you go to a big box store and you go to buy a sheet of drywall, 4 foot by 8 foot, along those 4 foot edges, you're going to have the butt joints. Now, the butt joint is the true thickness of the drywall. So, in this case, this is all 1/2 inch drywall, so 1/2 inch thick in the middle, and then if I go along this 4 foot edge, it's going to be 1/2 inch thick. But along that 8 foot edge, obviously this piece has been cut, the long edge of the drywall, you're going to have a tapered edge, which the drywall goes from like 1/2 inch down to 3/8, something like that. You can see how it tapers down a bit. The reason it's tapered down is because when we go to tape the tapered edge, big tape, it really helps to hide that seam. You really don't see it. It's really easy to hide it. Now with the butt joints, it's a lot trickier, right? Because it's not tapered down. It's the true thickness of the drywall. So it's important that you take all these steps and do this properly. The more time you spend now, the nicer it'll look in the long run. So 4 important tips before we get into actually how to tape the joint. Tip number 1, use paper tape, and use brand new paper tape. Earlier on in this job, I ended up using some older paper tape that I had, and it was a little damp and it just wasn't coming out nice. As soon as I switched over to a brand new roll of paper tape, night and day difference. This stuff's really cheap. It's like $2 or $3, I think, for a 250 foot roll, something like that. So don't cheap out on the paper tape. Second tip, really important tip here. If you have gaps in the drywall that's larger than maybe an 1/8 inch, even a little bit smaller than that, you're going to want to pre-fill those gaps. And this is huge. I can't stress this enough. So why do we pre-fill? If you have large gaps in the drywall, right, and you're trying to use like this regular wet mud, this is a +3 compound. If you have a large gap and you try and fill in that gap, don't let it dry and then try and tape over that, well, you're going to be fighting gravity. Gravity's going to want to push that down, and you'll notice that the tape bulges out a little bit. It's just no good. So if you have those large gaps, you gotta pre-fill. This is huge. Such a pro tip, but it's so important that you do this. It takes more time, but 100% necessary. Now, when it comes to pre-filling, I recommend you use something called hot mud. And hot mud is basically dry powder mix, and you can buy this at any big box store, of course, and there's actually different numbers on the bags. The numbers represent how many minutes it takes for that mud to actually cure. Now, I'm a little bit of a slow worker, so I like to get 45-minute hot mud. Consistency of that, I like it a little bit thick. Probably the consistency of peanut butter, something like that, because we don't want it to droop down. We're not going to, seal up all the little cracks. We're just going for the big cracks, right? We're trying to get in there, create a nice backing for that tape to go onto, and we just don't want the tape to have any problems later on. So make sure you pre-fill with some hot mud. Tip number 3, what size taping knife do you use? Personally, I like to use 6-inch taping knife. Some guys like to use 4-inch. It's kind of a matter of personal preference. The thing I like about the 6-inch is a little bit wider, and also you get a little bit more mud when you go to scoop this out of your mud pan. Really important tip here when we're talking about taping knives, make sure you get the knives that have the metal hammer on the back, and you'll see why that's so important shortly here. All right, the final thing I need to talk about is mud consistency. Notice that I have 3 buckets here. This is really important. So here I have my +3 joint compound, which I'm going to be using to tape the joints. Here I have a clean bucket. The orange bucket is just clean water. So that's the only water that I'm going to use to thin down the mud. It's important that you mix your mud well. And the final bucket, the white bucket here, is my wash bucket. So when I go to wash my tools at the end of the day, this is where I wash my tools. I never want to contaminate my clean water with the wash water, especially if you're using this hot mud, because if you get some of that hot mud residue in your joint compound, sometimes it just doesn't apply as smooth as it should. So always make sure you use clean water when you're mixing up your mud. Now for this +3 taping, I like it consistency wise somewhere in between, I don't know, like a yogurt and a peanut butter, which I'll show you what that looks like after I mix it up. But here I have an electric power drill, little paddle on there, so I'm going to get this mud mixed up, and we'll go in the other room, we'll tape up that butt joint. Now if you're curious where you can buy a nice set of knives, I'll leave a link in the description below. But the nice thing with these knives, here's a little pro tip. See this hook right here? Take this hook, hook it on the edge of the bucket. See how nice that pops off? There's two things that we got to do. One, you want to take your taping knife and run it up along the screws. Notice I didn't hear anything there? However, if I go along this wall right here, hear that sound? Hear that little click? What that click is there's a screw that's sticking out beyond the face of the drywall. What you need to do, you need to put that screw back recessed below the surface of the drywall. So it's a good idea to keep a little screwdriver on hand. Now you don't hear anything. Here's the second pro tip. When it comes to taping a butt joint, take the back side of your taping knife. It has that metal hammer edge. What I like to do is just push up along the joint, putting serious pressure up along that seam. You can even do that twice if you want. The reason why I do that, when you take those two butt ends of the drywall and you're trying to get these screws on that little, 1.5-inch 2x4 that runs up along the inside cavity of the wall, when you send these screws in, what will happen is it'll actually push out the outside edges of this sheet a little bit. And by taking the hammer side of your knife, applying pressure, what you're doing, you're pushing that back in. And that's really going to help out in the long run because it's going to help to keep this joint as flat as possible. So that's a good little pro tip right there. Everything looks good. All right, now we're ready for mud. I feel like most people, you just got to get it on there. Some people do like this. You can do this. I'm not a huge fan of doing it that way. Of course, I'm working lefty. Here's my recommendation on how you apply mud to this joint. Take some on your knife, clean off the edge a little bit. What you're going to do, put it along the joint and just run it up like that. Clean off the edges, go up along the joint. Typically I'd be able to get this a little bit wider, but I'm not really able to because of the clearance I'm working with the wall right now. Okay, so we have the joint all buttered. Now what we need to do, we need to flatten out this mud a little bit, get it a little bit smoother. I'm actually going to put a little bit more mud on my knife, clean off the edges. Just light pressure, like a 45-degree angle, I'm going to spread out this mud. It's not bad. Notice it's a little bit bare right there, so I'm going to take a little bit more mud, clean off the edges. Just work on getting mud a little bit more to the left there. See that? Gotta clean that up one more time. Light pressure. That's pretty good. Now that is ready for tape. Now I have the tape pre-cut, and it's really important that you apply the tape the right way. So this is obviously 4-foot high sheet of drywall, so you can pre-cut your tape at 4 feet for this. Now when it comes to taping, if you push on the tape, you'll notice that it has a tendency to fold in one direction. Now that edge, see that edge right there? That's going to face in towards that crack. So I'm going to start at the top, start at the bottom too, making sure that I get it right on the seam of the joint. Come down, make sure I'm right on the seam. Same thing, make sure I'm right on the seam. And from here, I'm going to grab my mud pan. I'm going to start in the middle, work my way up. Start in the middle, work my way down. Middle, a little bit light pressure. I just want it seated at first. Same thing on the bottom. We'll go ahead again, middle going up. Now I'm applying some pressure, trying to take out all that extra mud. You don't want to take out all the mud, but you do want to leave some mud back there for the tape to hang on to. Just like that. A little bit of pressure on the side. Notice how I cleaned up and feathered that edge. What you can do, put a lot of pressure on the right side or the left side at like a 45-degree angle. Taper that edge. Do the same thing going down. Clean it up a little bit. The bottom's the trickiest part. I think the easiest thing to do on the bottom, when you get to like the last inch or two, point the knife at like a downward 45-degree angle. Just push out that mud. You clean it up a little bit. Where's your stripe? Got to taper the edges a little bit. Putting pressure on the left side, pressure on the right side. That's pretty much it. Nice. Now, it's up to you. I recommend you leave it from this point on, but a lot of the pros will actually take a second coat. They'll put a second light coat over this. Personally, I really don't like to mess with it from here. I like to just let it sit, let it dry, and you come back in and do your second coat.